Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. In this episode, I'm joined by Guy Osmond, an ergonomics innovator, workplace wellbeing specialist, and one of the UK's most experienced voices in ergonomics and human factors, with more than 3 decades spent helping organisations understand how people really work. This is a wide-ranging and timely conversation about how the nature of work has changed and how our approach to ergonomics, well-being and risk needs to change with it. We explore why ergonomics is increasingly central to the future of work and why it can no longer be reduced to chairs, desks, and tick box DSE assessments. Guy shares powerful insights into the hidden crisis facing home and hybrid workers, including why many people are quietly suffering from physical discomfort and back pain but feel unable to speak up, often because they fear being forced back into the office. We also discuss how physical well-being has slipped down the agenda, even as mental health has rightly received more attention, and why the two are, in fact, inseparable. Guy explains the strong link between physical discomfort, cognitive load, mental well-being, presenteeism, and lost productivity, and why many organisations underestimate the true cost of ignoring this. A major part of the conversation focuses on neurodiversity and modern work, including why traditional DSE assessments often fall short, and what a more human, person-centred workplace needs approach really looks like in practice. We talk about human factors, workplace culture, psychological safety, and how organisations can design environments people actually want to work in. And finally, Guy shares practical advice for safety, well-being, and risk professionals on how to engage senior leaders, connect ergonomics to productivity and ROI, and move beyond compliance towards a genuinely supportive, effective workplace. If you're responsible for people, performance, or risk in a hybrid world, this episode will give you plenty to think about. I hope you enjoy it, and Happy New Year.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Guy.
Morning, Christian. Good to see you.
Yeah, been looking forward to this one. I think we're recording this in December, but I think we're going to put this out as our first episode of 2026. So I'll say Happy New Year, even though we haven't actually physically got to
Happy New Year. A bit like recording Christmas programs for the television. You see all this stuff at this time of year, and all the leaves are out and the stuff's in bloom, and everybody's wearing red for Santa hats and saying,
"Yeah, exactly." Yeah, I know. Yeah, one of my friends does visual effects, and he does a lot of Christmas adverts, and it's all done in the summer, and it's all very, very strange. Anyway, let's talk about ergonomics. So you've spent more than 30 years now in workplace ergonomics. When you first kind of got into the field, did you expect it to become that central to how we now think about work?
I didn't expect it to evolve in the way it has, because it's become a much more sort of holistic thing. Certainly we could see, I got into it just around the original display screen equipment regulations, so the early 90s, which meant there had been talk about repetitive strain injuries, had been claimed, so people were beginning to get the idea that actually you could get injuries just from sitting for long periods. And historically, it had been very much a focus. Health and safety was all about things like construction sites, oil and gas, where real accidents and death events were happening. And I remember the early conversations with people with, but these people just sit on their bottom all day. What on earth is there like? What can there be? So I could see it starting. And we were so early in, we actually registered ergonomics.co.uk because I thought this, this interweb thing might take off a bit. But I think it's moved on now to the extent perhaps that the physical ergonomics is taking a bit of a back seat, and the more human factors elements, mental health, neurodiversity, all of those topics. So I think most people are looking at it in a much more well-being related thing rather than just sort of ergonomics on its own, really.
Yeah. And when was there a particular moment, or was it a gradual process where you kind of realized that, as you've just said, it was moving past sort of just, furniture and posture into a sort of broader remit?
I think the first signs for us were, I suppose I ought to say that although the website's ergonomics.co.uk, historically our business was based as being furniture manufacturers, particularly a lot of seating. So historically, a lot of our business over the years has been dealing with individuals with musculoskeletal problems, backaches, RSI type problems, and so forth. But I suppose the time we really, really saw it a sort of, and there was a change in our thinking, was the big recession in 2008-9, when we were going to see people, as we had been doing previously, to say, and we've been told they've had a back problem, and therefore we need to talk to them about the possibility of, well, certainly improving their posture and probably looking at their basic chair wasn't adequate. In those days, things like height adjustable arms were still becoming quite a new concept, seat slide adjustment, things like that. Adjustability on chairs generally provided was not very good. So we were having conversations, and we've been having conversations, and much as you do with any sort of assessment process, you start just chatting. Tell me about it. What's the background? What are you coming across? What's bothering you? And it seems suddenly the conversations were not, well, I just get a really bad lower back problem, to, well, there's been redundancies, there's talk of more, I'm worried about job security, my wife wants to go on holiday, I'm not sure we can afford it, we're rowing about money, one of the children has started wetting the bed. Oh, hang on a minute, I thought this was a conversation about backache. And that was when we really started to see the really strong connection between mental and physical health. Yeah. And of course, that's just become more and more prominent. And through COVID in particular, the mental health thing became much more of a conversation it was okay to have historically. Yes. Sort of one of those quiet, covert discussions that people tried not to raise.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine as well, COVID sort of almost shined another light on that whole physical environment piece as well, though, didn't it? Because people were working from home that had never worked from home. And I imagine there's a lot of problems that were kind of created then and maybe stored up and are starting to appear more and more now.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. But I mean, first of all, we've been dealing with organisations that have been having home workers long before COVID. So we found, compared to a lot of general furniture suppliers, we were really geared up. Domestic deliveries was something we've been doing for years. Although obviously we went through a phase when we could only do doorstep deliveries, literally leave it there in a box on the doorstep. But generally speaking, we've been delivering to people's homes. We've been setting people's home working offices and so forth up for some considerable time. And I have to say, COVID to us, in terms of, the number of home worker chairs we sold and laptop stands and all this stuff, it was pretty good for us to the COVID. Now, it's a bit of an old joke now, but I used to say at the time, the one thing I used to love about COVID, and specifically lockdown, is if you had a delivery for somebody during a lockdown, at least you could count on them actually being there. Whereas
that's true. Yeah.
These days it's become more and more of an issue where we're still genuinely scheduling a delivery to take a chair to somebody and set them up. And you may get no message at all, or possibly you might get one at 8 o'clock in the morning saying, whoops, sorry, I'm going to the office today, I won't be there. And obviously, as you can imagine, scheduling deliveries to homes, one-offs, when you get a disrupt, somebody says, I don't want my 11 o'clock delivery, it pretty much throws the day out.
Yeah, yeah.
But if anything, I would say, and I've just been writing an article about this, that we've found that the display screen equipment process seems to have been sit more in the back seat in recent times. And I've actually just been involved in speaking on a webinar conference where, at the moment, we're literally just about to release the data, so I can't give you the whole thing, but there was, something like a third of organizations were saying their display screen equipment process, the DSE assessment process, actually was not really fit for purpose anymore and needed a complete overhaul and review. And when that number alone, I won't give you all the details, but when you think that this is legislation that's been in place, and let's face it, the DSE risk assessment, compared to some of the more complex things that you work with, and many of your colleagues in the safety and health health and safety profession do, is that actually a DSE assessment is pretty straightforward, but finding that a significant proportion either don't have one or don't have a process that works. And I think one of the other things we're seeing now, whilst organizations are still, very many haven't quite decided what on earth they are going to do about hybrid and home working and everything else. Many organizations are mandating returns to work and certain numbers of days, or just all come back to the office. There is an element we're seeing, and it's a significant proportion of actually organizations where if individuals at home are saying, you know what, I'm struggling at home for whatever reason, musculoskeletal health, mental health, whatever, their employers say, well, that's fine. We've got loads of space in the office. Just come into the office. So I've got no data on this, but I'm absolutely convinced there are a lot of people who are actually suffering in silence at home because they don't want to say, hey, I need some help, in case the answer to that, I need some help, is, well, just get into the office, because they want to stay at home. So I think, if anything, DSE at the moment is that sort of element to it. Post-COVID, it's certainly getting a lot less attention than it was during the pandemic, but I think probably it's now getting less attention than it has for many years. And it's legislation that's been in place for 30 odd years. And, things slip down the agenda, don't they, if you're not constantly reminded about them.
Yeah. And I think technology changes and all sorts of things change, and legislation needs to keep up. So what would you say then, in terms of people who are joining us today, who have colleagues and are responsible in some way for colleagues who are working from home and could be kind of suffering in silence? What sort of steps should people be taking to try and proactively address that?
Well, I think, that's part of the whole bigger piece of general health and well-being and so forth anyway. So we deal with many organizations who have all sorts of facilities in place. They have loads of information on their intranet. They have all sorts of mechanisms. And I was talking to a big finance institution, a health and safety manager, a little while ago, and he was saying that they now have, through the pandemic, things like mental health in particular, appointing mental health first aiders, that sort of thing. There's been a lot more channels available. But I think one of the problems with organizations is actually the larger the organization, the more channels there are. And actually, we've just done some stuff as part of an onboarding process with a client, where actually a number of people who joined the organization within the last couple of months were all on a big webinar where we were talking to them with occupational health and safety and HR from that organization. And they were talking about the professionals were talking about the elements and services and resources available to individuals. And most of them didn't even know most of this stuff existed. So my answer is just make sure, first of all, that there are channels available for people to communicate this, and that it's easy and widely recognized and what's there and how it's done. And my caveat with that would be, please do not assume that anything on the intranet is findable if people don't know exactly what they're looking for. Again, I spoke to somebody the other day who added a new wellbeing resource to their corporate intranet. And she said, I knew what it was. I knew exactly what I was looking for, and I couldn't find it. She said, I devised it, couldn't find it on the intranet. So how on earth would the normal employee, not quite knowing what there is they're looking for, be able to do it? And the other thing I would say, we've also, many organizations say, well, just ask your line manager. And categorically, in almost all scenarios, the line manager is not something they're measured on, it's not something they're targeted on. Middle management generally are under enormous workload, being squeezed from both directions. So however empathetic they may be to your needs or your colleagues' needs, whoever it is, they probably won't have the time or resource to actually be able to, or the training to be able to point you in the right direction. So I would say, whether it's an employee assistance program or whether there's something that there's an obvious first point of contact for everybody, but also then make sure that actually does do something and goes somewhere, so that it's not just given them, a whole load of signposting, which then they have to figure out, well, what do they have to do next?
Yeah. So is it we've got this situation where many home workers are feeling neglected, as you sort of said, and don't really want that response to be come back into the office, obviously. Is the problem that those things you just mentioned are lacking? In other words, it's a sort of systems problem, or is it that there's a gap, with the sort of mentality or the strategy from the sort of senior team in terms of not considering this to be a priority or an issue, or what's missing, I suppose, what's causing the gap that we need to overcome?
I think it's there's no sort of there will be a central policy, but it becomes very fragmented very quickly. And what
Right.
we're encountering is that there are, and we did a morning workshop a little while ago, and one of our speakers was actually, her topic was who owns well-being? Because I think all of these things, physical health, mental health, emotional health, all those, financial health, all of those elements that one has to consider, that all feed straight into mental health, they quite often are covered by lots of different bits and pieces. So one of the questions I quite often ask organizations is, where are your gaps? They've never done a gap analysis, and I usually often, but this is a conversation, unfortunately, doesn't go very far. So I'd love to say I've actually spoken to a client and been right through this, but usually they will say things. Well, obviously, we've got health and safety, we've got occupational health, we've got HR, we have mental health first aiders, a lot have health insurance, there are employee assistance programs, and there are all these different channels. But again, if you're sitting there as an employee with a backache or anxious or whatever it happens to be, or with ADHD, where do you go with that? Where do you start? And I think a lot of them are sort of piecemeal parts. And so they all sit under different things. I mean, ultimately, all this stuff, I think, should probably sit under the personnel director at C-suite level and then cascade down. But I think there are lots of bits that get picked up, and quite often in the well-being, and I use a sort of broader well-being term to cover all of those elements.
Yeah.
Very often, there are people who are just fabulously enthusiastic and really, really care about delivering this to the people. But they're not always in a position to have the influence they want to do. And also, I mean, I've seen examples comparatively, well, quite recently, of people who come in a well-being role to sort of start pulling all these things together. And then actually they've got all these, come into the organization very excited about the opportunity and the plan and all the rest of it. And then suddenly within a very large organization, they suddenly realize when it takes some 2 weeks to get their laptop, and then nobody's quite sure what their login is, and then they don't have access for security to certain elements of what they need to do, they suddenly realize that nothing's going to happen quickly, and then a sort of frustration creeps in. Am I sounding horribly cynical this morning? It does feel like it's just what I'm coming across. Christian, I can't hear you.
Apologies. I put myself on mute because I think I was coughing. What you said actually rings true with my experience in terms of what people do in my area, because similar, everyone's aware of the risks of these things, right? But and they do things, and they have systems, and they have processes, and they have this and they have that, and so on and so forth. But as you say, have you done that gap analysis? Have you looked at it with a beginner's mind? And that sometimes is a bit of a challenge that people sort of don't seem to embrace, shall we say? So I think, it's a difficult one, isn't it? It's just trying to get people to be open to, I guess, challenging themselves and sort of proving themselves wrong. But people don't tend to like to do that.
No, and I think, I mean, this is very much about the culture of the organization. If you want really good engagement, you've got to look after people. And this is conversations I have about workplace design as well, is you have to, there's a lot of conversations now about things like having quiet spaces, with the neurodiversity conversation, all the rest of it. But ultimately, if the culture of the organization is, everybody looking after themselves and being frightened to speak up, not having that psychological a sense of psychological safety and so forth. If that sort of thing, if the culture's wrong, it doesn't matter how many fabulous sofas you've got or privacy booths or whatever it happens to be. And I think it is interesting. I said we haven't been able to pursue this sort of gap analysis thing, but the client for whom we did this induction process, we are starting a program in the new year of greater awareness training. At the moment on specific topics where they've identified gaps where clearly nobody's even aware that there's anything existing. But I think that I would say somebody in a senior role in an organization who wants to know just what it's like and what that sort of gap is. If you don't want to do a formal gap analysis, a really good way to do it would actually be in either a formal or informal way. Just chat to your new staff, the people who've been onboarded recently, and just figure out, what they're doing, how they're doing it, what they know about, what they're unaware of. Because I was actually speaking to somebody yesterday whose historical job has been very much in internal comms within large organizations.
Yeah.
And I was just quoting a good friend of mine who's a change management specialist who says his process, so he's obviously constantly talking about all this stuff about culture and engagement, getting every alignment, all that sort of stuff. And he says, with his experience, generally speaking, God, don't use internal comms to communicate this. Don't give it to the comms department, because that's the one way to make sure nobody ever gets to understand and hear about it. Now, that's a cynical view, again, from experience. But I think with this sort of thing, people need to be, the old thing of if people don't know what they don't know, then you have to be innovative about how you approach it. You can't assume that just putting it onto the intranet or sticking it on a few notice boards or scrolling screens or whatever has got to get the message out there. It needs to be a more dynamic, proactive approach. And I also think that's something for which, again, don't delegate it to a manager and say, can you make all your team aware of this? Because they will have 1,000 more things on their plate, many of which, frankly, on a daily basis will be much higher priority than that broader strategic sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, identifying some great areas where safety and health initiatives fail, which is a shame. But I think we've got to talk about that, and then that gives people the opportunity to try and address it, doesn't it? So definitely a good thing to do.
I quite often come back a lot to the sort of cultural issue within the organization, and actually that whole process of it's a common thing, but allowing people to thrive. I'm not crazy about that expression because it's a bit overused, and I sort of assume it's been generated by AI whenever I see it in a social media post or on LinkedIn or something. But giving people that opportunity and the license to just query and confidently ask questions that challenge things. And I think a lot of organizations, this person I was talking to in internal comms, one of the other things she does is actually dealing with C-suite people to talk with them about their relationship with the more junior staff, how they're perceived. And very often, senior people think, well, I'm always, my door's always open, is the old-fashioned expression. But the bigger question should be, well, how many people ever come through it in that way? Because actually having the door open is a message you think just says, come and talk to me anytime. But actually, whether people feel confident to do that is a completely different thing altogether.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. Let's talk a bit about mental health. How strong in your experience is the link between physical discomfort, the type of which we've talked a little bit about, cognitive load, and mental well-being? How do you see that link?
I think there's definitely a connection, and I think it's a strong connection. I think there's all sorts of interesting sort of, and I'm not medically qualified. I'm not actually an ergonomist, so a lot of this is from. I spend a lot of time talking to people who are far more qualified and far more knowledgeable than me. And fortunately, over the years, I've been able to absorb stuff. Although as I get older, I think I sort of how much have I remembered and how much is gone. I have to find my notes somewhere. But
That's why I do the podcast, because I get to spend time learning from people. Yeah.
so my thinking is that, or my experience is that actually one or other can impact the other as well. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a connection, but things physically about, just things about posture, simple stuff like actually, if you slouch forward as often we do, if we're not thinking about it, then that impacts, it closes up your diaphragm, it impacts how you're breathing. There are all sorts of other things. A friend of mine who's a psychologist specialized in acoustics talks about psychoacoustics, actually the impact of noise. And we're particularly seeing, and there's quite a lot in the press about that these days, that noise has become far more of an issue than it ever was in the workplace. And I find it an amusing irony that actually people are moaning about that there seems to be more noise in the office when there's actually fewer people. So how is that happening? But it's again, we've become more aware of it. So the impact of things like, so we're certainly seeing the impact on people's mental health of things beyond the stuff you'd think was obvious. So if you've got problems at home in your relationship or financial worries, or one of your children is ill, that inevitably is going to impact how you're feeling. But actually, there are all manner of other things just day to day in the office. If you can't actually, you mentioned about that whole thing of the nature of the workplace, and I was saying about whether there are places to go for. I think actually just before we started recording, wasn't it? So but talking about where are there quiet zones and things. So I think those things overlap. I think the other a major thing is actually, as I was saying earlier, the very fact we're able to talk about mental health. So what we actually don't know is how much of all the stuff we're talking about today in our general conversation about wellbeing, how much of it has always been there, but nobody was just owning up to it or talking about it. They were just suffering in silence. And certainly when you're talking with neurodiversity, neurodivergent individuals talk about masking constantly, about, having just got into the habit of closing out certain behaviors or concealing their natural self just to fit in better. And of course, there's a lot of evidence with mental health issues that actually a lot of people who are neurodivergent suffer with mental health. So there's a connection there. And again, which comes first? But undoubtedly, well, as I say, going back to my earlier example, the physical and mental connection, we no longer go to somebody who's complaining of backache, to keep this in a nice simplistic example. We no longer go there assuming that they've got a disc problem or they've got a sports injury or it's something that is directly physically related. It could actually just be a manifestation of some other bigger issues. And we certainly encounter that where, we come away and again, we have to be careful how we manage that, not just from data protection, but also in terms of sensitivity to the individual's needs and who's involved in the communication chain within the employer's organization. But, sometimes, and I wouldn't say it's a growing number, but it seems to me the proportion where this conversation crops up is larger than it was 20 years ago. It's actually, we come away thinking, and perhaps, if appropriate, saying, we've done all we can physically. We can actually sort this person's chair out, or we've shown them how to get their screen to the right height and their workstation laid out so they can sit better, improve their posture, and reduce the load on their body. But actually, there's some deep-rooted stuff here that none of that is really going to help. It may have some sort of psychological effect in as much that because we're going in, because we're going through process, because hopefully there are actions that follow from that, then that person feels more valued and therefore their self-esteem or their general sense of well-being is enhanced by the very fact that process has taken place. But, some of that may even be a sort of placebo effect in practice. But the reality is we do just come across these other scenarios, which are part of a bigger
Yeah.
more holistic approach. And
Yeah.
we've actually, I've literally, my colleague Alex and I have just had an article published in the British Safety Council Safety Management magazine talking about whether a display screen equipment, a traditional DSE assessment in the old school, and many organizations where they're doing it still ticking the boxes, what's the height of your screen and can you adjust your chair? Whether that's really enough, and we ought to be looking at a more holistic workplace needs process.
Yes.
So to just pick up on those other elements that aren't anything to do with whether your chair's the right height and whether you can adjust the armrest.
Yeah, yeah. Let's return to this bigger picture in a second, because I want to talk a bit about neurodiversity and some of the things you just spoke about. But just if we just return back to that physical discomfort piece, I'm assuming that you must have some examples of where a sort of long-term untreated discomfort has led to performance issues, engagement issues, absence, presenteeism. In other words, there must be a fair bit of evidence that you do need to get that kind of basic stuff right, or it will have a negative impact on things.
Yes, undoubtedly. And going back to my not database, but just general experience observation earlier, that actually I'm absolutely certain there are lots of people working at home suffering in silence. There is immediately a presenteeism issue there. There is lost productivity because they cannot work at full capacity if they're actually just distracted. I always say to people, if you've never suffered from backache or anything, have you ever had a toothache? Because a toothache is a really good example of extreme and often quite sudden and really debilitating pain. And I ever say, if you've ever thought about, if you can remember when you've had a toothache and maybe you could get an appointment that day with a dentist, but not till 11 o'clock, and you think, okay, well, I'll just work till I have to go. And what do you get done in that morning? Absolutely nothing, because you are so distracted, you can't focus. And I've got a graph I've been using for many, many years, and I'm not sure how easy this is to describe in words, but basically the idea is that a lot of organizations measure absenteeism because it's really, it's binary, either there or they're not. We've not done any research ourselves, but the research I've found in my researches on presenteeism is presenteeism can be costing an organization anything between, the figures I've seen suggest between 4 and 7 times the cost of absenteeism if they're measuring that. I'm sure you've mentioned presenteeism, so you're familiar with all this stuff, I'm sure. But the assumption of absenteeism is, that graph is a horizontal line, they're performing perfectly well, and then it's a vertical drop because the next day they're not there. But of course it isn't. That line across in terms of performance is slowly but surely slipping or rapidly deteriorating. And that gap between the right angle, which is okay performance and then not there, and that deterioration, that big gap in the middle of that graph isn't. So I'm not sure that works at all as a verbal.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, don't worry.
That lost presenteeism is a pretty big chunk of productivity, and I think people don't sort of fully realize that. So I think there's no doubt there are lots of people underperforming at this moment. But the trouble is they may be underperforming, but they're putting in extra hours working at home to make it up. So there's all sorts of reasons why there might be no direct evidence of that to the organization. So I think the problem is, how do you quantify it? I'm personally in no doubt there is an enormous loss of productivity for the reasons I've just described. But there will be all sorts of other things screening that actual, the data, not least just the incredible difficulty of measuring presenteeism anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's talk about a bit of the bigger picture then. So we actually were introduced by Rosie Russell, and she said to me, "Oh, you've got to speak to Guy because ergonomics is the future of work." And that kind of brings us into some of the bigger topics that we've already spoken about. But I mean, firstly, how would you agree with that assessment?
I think, I mean, Rosie's lovely. We have incredibly intense conversations, some of which I find absolutely exhausting because she's so clever and goes off on so many other tangents. Although, having said which, I'm not keeping to the point very well today either. So, but coming back to your specific question, I think that ergonomics, and I think a lot of people still think ergonomics is all about your chair.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the modern hybrid workplace, not just in where people are actually working, whether it's in the office, a coffee shop, at home, or whatever, but even in a lot of offices now, a lot of offices that have been sort of refitted in the last few years, look more like a hotel lobby than an actual office. And so people just aren't thinking about ergonomics. And people, when they do think of ergonomics, think of it actually in the context of sitting at a computer with a screen in front of you. And of course, that's all changing because we're doing more and more voice recognition and all the AI and so the whole process of interacting with some communications medium to actually convey messages or do research or whatever is changing. But I think what is definitely at the moment being neglected is ergonomics in the sense of that physical stuff, because people are thinking there are so many other bigger topics. And in fact, the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors is about to publish, I think it's coming early in the new year. I've had a little involvement in the conversations about it. They've done a dramatic, or a special interest group has done, of ergonomists have done a special, have done a complete review of what exactly is hybrid working, home working, and a more dynamic approach to the whole thing. So I think I would say that ergonomics is really central, but don't think of it as many people who are not ergonomists do. When I'm sure you're the same in your professional role.
Yeah.
When we live and breathe some sort of element of life, we just take it all for granted. When somebody says, sorry, say that again, something you're talking about every single day, you look at them like they're some sort of idiot. But the reality, of course, that's not true at all. It's just not part of their daily life. And so I think most people think of ergonomics either as an orthopedic chair. I heard that term many times over the years. Or sometimes I've certainly heard ergonomics in the context of car design, and that crops up a lot in terms of, can you see your controls? Can you reach the brake and all that sort of thing? Yeah. So I'm finding myself more and more talking about ergonomics in the context of human factors.
Yeah.
And a lot of people interchange those terms. But to me, from the way I use it, ergonomics is a physical thing. So it is about the layout of your screen and your computer and your desk and your chair, or the position of your car seat and the angle of the steering wheel, and can you see the mirrors and all that sort of stuff. But in human factors, it's a much more broad conversation. So it's including noise is part of that, undoubtedly. So it's the human experience element. So it's about, that brings into elements of the culture. I mean, I'm sure you talk about safety culture within organizations. So the culture of the business, the way people communicate, the way they interact, and those can be dramatically different if you're a very traditional old school solicitor's practice with lots of Chesterfield sofas around the place and so forth. That will be very different if you are a dynamic, new tech business doing AI and social media and all the rest of it. What that workforce looks like, works like, thinks like, and the sort of needs they have will be very different. So I would say ergonomics is absolutely crucial, but don't think of ergonomics as that trivial, well, not trivial, but it's a trivial element. It's a very small part. It's an important part, but of the whole big picture of how are people interacting with their work environment, with each other, with how they're feeling, and all those other things. And human factors as a discipline, applies system thinking to different elements of how we work, and does things like in the motor industry, there's all sorts of people working on self-driving cars and things, and how we interact with a vehicle when there's no human driving it, It's very different. I'm still not sure. I haven't done it yet, but I'm still
No.
not sure how keen I am to step into a Waymo car. And I think Waymo are the main people at the moment, and actually find there's nobody sitting in front.
Mm.
How am I going to feel as it pulls away or gains speed or gets to the first set of traffic lights? So ergonomics to me, in that very broad sense, is really central. And I think the good part of it is lots of people in workplace design, in job design, in the sort of thing you're doing with your clients in terms of how they're interacting with the challenges and risks of their business. A lot of us are doing ergonomics all the time. We just don't call it that.
Yeah.
And so what we need to do is get more people to just understand more of the sort of science and thinking behind it. So, example in manufacturing, when people do things like Kaizen and 5S and things like that, where they're streamlining processes and they're looking at a more efficient way to do things, a lot of what they're doing is actually, human factors, ergonomics elements. Do we need to bring that process closer to that? Why are they walking across the building to do that, to come back again? What's the difference? Why are left-handed people finding this impossibly difficult to do and right-handed people don't even think about it? So yes, I would say I'd absolutely agree with Rosie, but I make it a very big picture view of ergonomics and human factors.
Yeah, lovely. You mentioned neurodiversity, and I wanted just to touch on that a little bit. Yeah. So would it be fair to say that the kind of traditional DSE assessment approach may be falling short for neurodivergent workers, and then if so, what does a kind of more human, person-centered approach to workplace needs actually look like in practice?
So I think there's two elements for that. First of all, obviously, there's a statutory requirement to carry out a DSE assessment. There's a lot of debate, which I won't get into at this stage of our conversation today, about how valid the DSE assessment process is because of all the technology changes and all the other elements. But our approach to DSE is very much about it being a conversation rather than working through a checklist. And again, I'm sure, again, in the nature of your day-to-day work, actually, I just on that, my brother he's retired now, but used to be in the oil and gas business. And one of the things they found when they were looking at their procedures were, their statutory operating procedure and stuff, is that they would get people, introverts and extroverts, and using the insights thing, reds to look at it and blues to look at it, if you're familiar with the insights colors, to get, because any sort of standard operating procedure was the expression I'm looking for. Your blue person wants it to run to 8 sides of A4, and your red person wants to know what's the minimum they can do to just fulfill all their requirements.
Yeah.
And so that sort of approach to things, and I mentioned insights because we've been using it internally originally as a sort of recruitment thing, but very much a sort of team interaction tool for about 20 years now. So I'm very familiar with that sort of thinking. I know some people say it's very simplistic, but we actually found it was a good way of actually getting people to understand characteristics and traits. So our approach is very much making sure we cover the sort of, the key stages you have to do to comply with a statutory requirement. Because again, a lot of our corporate clients that we provide various different services on this, they need to fulfill their statutory obligations, but actually make it much more of a conversation. So to actually pick up on what sort of elements of the process are or the nature of the work are presenting issues. So, a good example, somebody with ADHD may have a chair that fits them perfectly, but the fact they can't sit in it for more than about 8 seconds without needing to move and jump about or tap their feet or whatever is nothing to do with the anthropometric fit of the chair to them. It's actually entirely about how they think, how they work, and how they are. So we would, we've certainly, I mean, we now have some chairs that actually offer much more movement just by how you use them. And one of the things we've been selling years, the whole Capisco chair, which you can sit front ways or back ways. We actually had somebody in recently, a consultant that we were using, who was looking at our data security, and I'm making no judgments because I'm not a specialist, but this young lady showed a lot of signs of being really absorbed in the work, really well aligned to the whole data security process. And my sort of brain, I have to admit, all that process I really struggle with. I make sure that I've got people who are really good at that to make sure we're all on top of it, because I'm the last person to leave in charge of that. But this young lady was just, when she wasn't typing, she was typing up the notes for the meeting. When she wasn't typing, she had a little 2 or 3 fidget toys she was playing with, and she was moving about. And I brought this Capisco chair in, which you could sort of saddle type seat. You can sit facing forward, you can spin it round, lean the other way with it. So leaning on what was the back, but leaning forward to support your chest. And she adopted probably 50 different postures during the course of the next hour or so, and she just loved it, because actually she felt she was actually more productive because she just had something that completely accommodated her. I mean, again, I'm using a very specific example, but it demonstrates the sort of thinking that we take about talking about. Again, we're not big on labels. If people want to say, I have DHD or I am autistic or whatever it happens to be, that's fine, and we can work with that. But that doesn't send us down. It gives us some ideas about things we should be talking about, but it doesn't send us down a particular route. We don't have a process which, you get to that question, you branch off and you do this. It's very much a conversational process, because as you know, the best way to carry out an effective risk assessment is to actually discuss, and whatever sort of risk assessment that is talk to the people who are dealing with that day to day, because they're the ones who know what the issues are, they know what the impediments to do it effectively are, they know what the stumbling blocks to the process. So we apply that same sort of rationale, conversational rationale, to pick up on it. So if we're only briefed for a DSE assessment, we may make some notes, again with the client's permission, to suggest alternative things to be thinking about. And indeed, we might suggest, even to some, in certain circumstances, depending on our brief, we get very specific guidance from different employers. We might even say a sit-stand desk, because that will enable them to stand up and sit down, and with a Capisco chair. And I'm using that not as a particular promotion for that product, but product,
an example.
Illustrate, they can sit, stand, or perch. So all of those things come into the conversation. And I have to say, it makes the whole assessment process much more fun than just going through the rather dry HSE questions that are now 30 years old.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, we should be, rather than focusing on kind of compliance, we should be approaching this through more of a personalized, human-centered, neurodiversity, inclusivity lens. Is that fair to say?
I would apply that to pretty much everything we do in work and workplace these days, but specific with DSE, any process which has statutory requirements, you must ensure that you cover those statutory requirements.
Of course.
But I think a more personal approach to, and the irony of this, we've been talking for over 30 years, the nature of ergonomics is everybody's different. And if you design for the average, you just end up with something which almost nobody likes. Or nobody likes. And obviously, we've been talking about dealing with the 95 and 5th percentiles and all those conversations about the extremities of the bell curve traditionally. But actually, that's been in a sort of physical sense. So we've been doing those sort of conversations, talking to organizations when they want a lot of chairs, when they're not talking about an individual, or they're designing a workstation layout. But actually, you can then just apply that thinking to the holistic approach to it, which was what we've been doing more and more over the years. And actually, what do people need to work effectively? And there will be people who actually are incredibly productive on the sofa with their laptop in their lap, just as long as they don't do it for very long and they stand up and stretch and get some movement in and sit in a more traditional pose. So, our posture guidance, which we've been using for 20 odd years, is, the best posture is your next posture. Don't adopt anything for long periods of time. Keep moving about.
Yeah. All makes sense. Last couple of questions, Guy. What advice would you give to somebody who is a safety wellbeing professional who wants to engage the C-suite about these kinds of issues we've been speaking about today?
Quickest and easiest is find a board member who's got a really bad backache. That's the easiest way to get a champion on board. And it's quite interesting because we've sort of done we've done, partners at Magic Circle solicitors and places like that who, you walk in, they say, look, I can give you 10 minutes. And we say, look, we need 30 minutes to go through the process and indeed to come back and set you up. And actually, usually they're really resentful because they're probably charging, I don't know, £1,000, £2,000 an hour. And this is just lost revenue with this trivial little thing like how do you get comfortable in your chair? But the reality is, most of the people we go through that process, or not most, a very high proportion of the people we go through, not only the assessment, but then the follow-up when the chair is delivered and we set them up, show them what all the controls are for, what they're trying to achieve, why they want to achieve that. The number of people say, good grief, I'd never even thought about all of this, And, these people often are in their 50s or 60s, but equally, they can be in their 20s and 30s because we're doing a lot of youngsters straight out of uni now because they've been adopting really poor postures, sitting on the bed with their laptop and all the rest of it. So C-suite is the easiest way to do it if you can find somebody who is that champion. But if not, I would say try and find a way to actually incorporate it in. It's always difficult to be sort of generic guidance because every organization operates, of course, differently. But try and find a way to integrate that conversation bring it into the ROI type of conversation. You are making a conversation about productivity, about presenteeism, and then look at who are the vociferous champions within the organization. So if you've got somebody in wellbeing, or you've got somebody in HR who's taking a real, they're looking really carefully at their absenteeism issues, start looking at those absenteeism issues and looking at what proportion of those are musculoskeletal. And then say, okay, so I said potentially 4 to 7 times, but let's say, I don't know, it's costing the business £100,000 in absenteeism due to musculoskeletal issues. Well, research shows it's probably not costing that. It's probably costing them, as I said, 4 to 7 times in presenteeism issues. But let's not go crazy. Let's just say it's double. So your £100,000 cost has gone to £200,000 cost. Well, surely there ought to be, and this is where the problem comes between interdepartmental budgets and so forth. But if we can make a £200,000 saving, can't we spend 50 grand on what? I'm plucking numbers from the sky.
Yeah, of course,
the arithmetic, but that's the trick. Find somebody who just gets that this is not, good ergonomics is not a cost; it's an investment.
Yeah.
And that's the thing you need to keep banging on. Try some pilot schemes. We work with organizations and with occupational health physio companies collaborating to say, we can bring down your absenteeism. And when you can start to demonstrate, again, things like, early intervention, that's another key thing that if you, for example, you offer occupational health within the business, making sure everybody understands that, making sure they're getting to it quickly, you can then demonstrate. I've got a good friend who runs an occupational health physio business. His main objective is get to talk to companies and do reviews quarterly on what impact is physiotherapy having on their workforce. And the same thing applies to ergonomics. So finding somebody with an ear and collaborators, other champions, work together with other departments with the same objective. I was talking to somebody yesterday, I talk with lots of different communities, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that they're all generally, whether they're in occupational health, health and safety, HR, facilities management, corporate real estate, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health specialists, they're all ultimately looking to the same general well-being goal. And they're all coming from different routes, often using different vocabulary. But if a few more of them could work together within organizations and not take the siloed approach, which is, I'm doing my thing. And I know culturally that's hard to do, but if you can find other people who are banging a different drum, but basically to the same tune as you, then find ways to pull that together and collaborate. And obviously, I'm happy to chat to anybody who'd like to think about it.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, some really, really good advice there. So if people do want to chat, Guy, where is a good place to do that? Might it be LinkedIn? And then anything you wanted to plug, anything coming up? What's the website and all of that stuff?
So first of all, I'm on LinkedIn, Guy Osmond, pretty easy to find. I'm pretty active, goes in fits and starts a bit. So sometimes I'm too busy doing actual work to be busy posting, but I do have some help with it. So I try and keep some good stuff. And I actually like to offer not just, what we're doing now, but references to new reports, new research and so forth.
Yeah.
In terms of the particular thing we're looking at this, and our websites, as I said, ergonomics.co.uk, and my email address is guy.osmond@ergonomics.co.uk. But the thing we're looking at the moment is we've launched a service called AOP, Assisted Accelerated Outcome Process. And we're specifically looking at people who are using access to work or trying to use access to work. And we've worked in and around and with access to work with a program pretty much since I started, 3 decades. And I've seen what it was. I've seen how brilliant it has been. And it's quite distressing to see just how appalling the service is at the moment. I've seen people who've had emails saying, thank you for your application for access to work, hear back from us within 32 weeks. There were stats on LinkedIn within the last couple of days. So bearing in mind when this is going out, about 6 weeks ago, about the information from the government that they are currently rejecting 1/3, and this is government stats, this is not hearsay, they're currently rejecting 1/3 of access to work applications. And I'm talking to people who've had funding dramatically cut. So anybody who has historically seen access to work as a way to facilitate the needs of individuals, keep in mind all that issue about presenteeism while they're waiting, productivity loss, possibly absenteeism, and the management overhead of actually just trying to keep chasing. I was talking to somebody the other day who'd been on hold to DWP for an hour, and when they got through, were told they had to ring a different number. And so they then had another 20 minutes ringing another number. So it's very frustrating. It's very time consuming. It's very stressful. Ours is not government funded. It's a commercial process. I'll make no pretense about that. But we're currently delivering almost all. There are some circumstances where it takes longer because of holidays or whatever. But we're delivering first assessment, triage within 48 hours, first assessment within 2 weeks, and most outcomes within 8 weeks, job done.
Nice. Yeah.
So that's, and I'm not trying to undermine access to work. I would love for it to be a brilliant scheme that does what it used to do really well for people with disabilities. But, I'm being commercial. There's an opportunity here, but actually everybody we take out of the access to work scheme is also providing funding available for the people who really need and deserve, the absolute maximum they can get.
And speeding it up for other people as well.
Well, one would hope so. One person at a time. There's 60,000 in the list at the moment. So I'm not sure how long before our impact will be visible, but we'll keep banging away at it.
Good stuff. All right, Guy. Well, thank you so much for today. Really fascinating stuff. And as Rosie said, the future of work. So really appreciate your time.
And I should make a public plug. Thank you to Rosie for the introduction as well.
Indeed. All right. Thanks a lot, Guy. And thanks to you for joining Guy and I this week. And we'll see you again next week for another podcast.
Great, Christian. Thank you very much indeed. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.